it's not going to have a significant impact by that time. So all of them share this idea. And in fact, it's not just the companies now. The US federal government has a program that was started last year that said we should be looking to try to get like the first, and what I mean by like, what does it mean to start? That you've got something that's putting electricity on the grid, a pilot, what we call it. And if that can get started like in the early 2030s, the idea of ramping it up, makes sense. And it's math, right?
Yeah.
So that's the ambition. Then the question is, and actually this is different because the government program, and they vary around in this. So for example, the United Kingdom's government idea was to get the first one on by 2040. And China has ambitions probably middle 2030s. Or maybe a little bit later. And Europe, continental Europe, it's a little bit, I'm not exactly sure where it is, but it's like later. It's like 2050 or 2060 because it's mostly linked to the ITER timeline as well too. The fusion companies, which makes sense, it's like, of course they've got the most aggressive timelines. It's like, we're going to map the human genome faster as well too, right? So it's interesting about where we are. And I think, we're not all the way there, but my intuition tells me we're probably going to have a couple of cracks at it, actually, on that timeline. So this is where we have to be careful, though. You say commercial fusion. What does that mean? Commercial fusion to me means that you actually have a known quantity about what it costs to build, and what it costs to operate, and the reliability of putting energy on the grid. That's commercial fusion. It's like, so it turns out that that's not necessarily exactly the first fusion devices that put electricity on the grid, because there's a learning curve to get like better and better at it. But that's probably, I would suspect, the biggest hurdle is to get to the first one.
The work I've done, the work I continue to do with autonomous vehicles and semi-autonomous vehicles, there's an interesting parallel there where a bunch of companies announced a deadline for themselves in 2020, 21, 22, and only a small subset of those companies have actually really pushed that forward. There's Google with Waymo, or Alphabet rather, and then there's Tesla with semi-autonomous driving in their autopilot, full self-driving mode. And those are different approaches. So Tesla is achieving much, much higher scale, but the sort of the quality of the drive is semi-autonomous, right? I don't know if there's a metaphor or an analogy here.
Yeah.
And then there's Waymo that's focusing on very specific cities, but achieving real full autonomy with actual passengers, but the scale is much smaller. So I wonder, just like you said, there'll be these kinds of similar kind of really hard pushes.
Absolutely. So actually, this is it's why I'm encouraged about fusion. So fusion's still hard. Let's let everyone be clear, because of the science underneath it of achieving the right conditions for the plasma, basically is a yardstick that you have to put up against all of them. What's encouraging that I see in this, and it's actually what happens when you sort of let loose the creativity of this, is maybe I'll go back to first principles. So fusion is also a fairly strange. So if you think about building a coal plant, like burning wood and coal and gas is actually not that much different from each other, because they're kind of about the same physical conditions, and you get the fuel and you light it. Fusion is remember I told you that there's this condition of the temperature, which is kind of universal. But if you take the density of the fuel between magnetic fusion and inertial fusion, they're different by about a factor of 10 billion. Mm-hmm. So the density of the fuel really matters. And actually, so does this means the energy confinement time is also different by a factor of 10 billion as well too, because it's the product of those two. So one's really dense and short-lived, and the other one's really long-lived and actually under-dense as well too. So what that means is that the way to get the underlying physical state is so different among these different approaches. What it lends itself to is, does this mean that eventual commercial products will actually fill different needs in the energy system? So it sort of goes to your comment about, I have to suspect this. It's like, because anything that is high tech and is like a really important thing in our economy tends to never find its way as only one manifestation. Like, look at transportation as well too. We have scooters, Vespas, overland trucks, cars, electric cars. Of course we have these because they meet different demands in it. So what's interesting, that I find fascinating now is that we have in fusion, it's going to look like that. That probably there's while the near term focus is on electricity production, there might even be different kinds of markets that actually make sense in some places, less in others. It comes to trade offs because we haven't really talked about the engineering yet, but the engineering really matters, like to the operation of the device. And so it could be that I suspect what we'll end up with is several different configurations which have different features, which are trade-offs basically in the energy market.
What do you see as the major engineering or general hurdles
Yeah.
that are in the way?
Yeah. So the first one is just the cost of building a single unit. So fusion has, and it's actually interesting you talked about the different models that you have. So fusion has one of its interesting limitations is that it's very hard. It almost at some point becomes physically impossible to actually make small power units. Like a kilowatt, 1,000 watts, which is like a personal home, like is about 1,000 watts, or your personal use of energy of electricity is about like 1,000 watts. This is basically impossible for a single unit to do this. So like you're not going to have a fusion like power plant like as your furnace or your electric heater in your home. And the reason for this comes from the fact that fusion relies on it being, it's not just that it's very hot, it's that the fusion power is the heating source to keep it hot. So if you go too small, it basically just cannot keep it hot. That's so it's interesting is that this is one of the hard parts. So this means that the individual units, and it varies from concept to concept, but the National Academy's report that came out last year sort of put the benchmark as being like probably the minimum size looks like around 50 million watts of electricity, which is like enough for like a small to mid-sized city actually. So that is so that's sort of like a scale challenge, and in fact, it's one of the reasons why in Commonwealth and in other private sector ones, like they try to push this down actually of trying to get to these smaller units just because it reduces the cost of it. Then probably, obviously, I would say it's an obvious one, like achieving the fusion state itself and high gain is a hard one, but we already talked about.
What kind of hurdle, what kind of challenge is that?
That's achieving the right temperature, density, and energy confinement time in the fuel itself, in the plasma itself. And so some of the configurations which are being chosen have quite a ways to go. In fact, I've seen those, but what their consideration is, oh yes, but by our particular configuration, the engineering simplicity